So now what I want to do is take the last two things we've learned about, aggregate expenditures and aggregate demand, and see how they work together, see how they relate. So first, we have right here is going to be a point on our aggregate demand curve. So for now, we're going to start off with just one dot. And so what this is telling us is I take a look at my economy, price level is 100, GDP is about 10. And all right, now let's think about what that means for aggregate expenditures. So for aggregate expenditures, if I tell you that we started off here, so we start off at an equilibrium, that must mean that the point where aggregate expenditures that's the point where aggregate expenditures curve or line intersects with the equilibrium condition. So remember, aggregate expenditures, this is combining everyone's behavior. So these are all of us are always consuming 5, always spending 5, and no matter if we have no income, and then increasing our spending accordingly. And so again, this is all how everyone behaves. Well, we expect to in an equilibrium, it should be the case that everyone's spending combined gives us the total spending and the total output of the economy, which means that must happen at 10, because this tells us that we start off in an equilibrium with a GDP of 10. All right, now let's think about what happens when the price level falls. So we're going to say the price level goes from 100 down to 90. 100 down to 90. When that happens, again, I'm feeling richer. I feel like that money in my pocket's doing better. For reasons you talked about last time, we think people are going to spend more on investments. We're going to see net exports go up. All of these means that our spending, aggregate expenditures go up. So now everyone's spending more money, which means that prices fall, CI and NX increase, so aggregate expenditures increase, and this is a shift up. So this is something changing other than just this is something causing aggregate expenditures to change other than a change in real GDP. This is something causes prices to fall, and so as a result, we're going to start spending more money. That means we get this shift up, and eventually we should reach an equilibrium where the amount that we're spending we're buying is equal to the amount we're producing. So here's our new equilibrium. What that means is in our new equilibrium, our real GDP is 17 and aggregate expenditures is 17. So what this is telling us is, all right, well, now what we just learned is that equilibrium GDP has increased, right? It's gone from 10 up to 17. So now we can show that here. So I already told you price went down to 90. This thing told us that GDP is going up to 17. So now we have another point on our aggregate demand curve. All right, now what if the price level rises? So we're going to say the price level goes from 100 up to 110. So now all of a sudden that money I've got under my pillow and carried around in my wallet, all of a sudden that can't buy as much stuff. So expenditures are going to go down. Remember, if we're thinking about real GDP, I'm going to be able to buy less stuff. So now my expenditures shift down. And once we get to another equilibrium, now this new point here where we're in equilibrium means GDP has gone from 10 down to 3. So we can graph that again. Price goes up to 110. real GDP goes down to 3. So now we've got 3 points together. So these are the original. Price goes down, GDP goes up. Price goes up, GDP goes down. We connect all them. All of these combined, when we connect them, give us our reduction in aggregate demand. Or sorry, give us that, let us show that aggregate demand slopes down. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I know there was a little bit of, I think the workbook sort of gives you graphs and doesn't really give you a lot of text and blanks. So you can kind of fill it in as you wish. Okay. So this aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. Any change in the components of aggregate demand will shift the aggregate demand curve. So what that means is the components of aggregate demand, so increase CIG or NX, those will increase aggregate demand. And again, by increase, if we're changing the increase means a shift of the curve. So increases in CIG or NX will increase aggregate demand. And again, that is a shift of the curve. So the whole curve will move this way. Decreases in CIG or NX will decrease aggregate demand. Which would mean it would shift this way. Again, just like, and so this is very similar idea to the demand for a product, which is if we change price, in this case price level, we get movement along the curve. If we change something else, so if for whatever reason we're all feeling good this morning, we woke up and we all went and bought a car, that is an increase in something other than price, so that is a shift of aggregate demand. Question, what happens if the real interest rate decreases? The real interest rate decreases, investment will increase, and the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So why is this? Well, interest rate decreases, it becomes cheaper for Michael Scott to borrow money to buy those forklifts. Investment increases. Investment is a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand increases, which means that it is a shift to the right. This is, we were here, more investment because interest rates changed. Interest rates are something else. They're something other than prices changing, so we shift out. All right, next one, which of the following is not true? The answer here is B. An increase in the price level will not shift aggregate demand to the right. So this is not true. An increase in the price level, what does that give us if we increase the price level? That leads to movement along the demand curve. So again, think about it. We started off right here. When we increase the price level, that is what's on the y-axis. That is movement along the demand curve. So let's look at a historical example. This is unemployment during the Great Depression. You see in this spot we have unemployment gets very high, over 20%, which is extremely high. And then it goes down a little, and then it gets back to almost 20%. And we really don't see the employment go back down to a normal level until around the beginning of World War II. And so you think about it, that corresponds with a huge increase in government spending. So we increased aggregate demand. Government spending is a component of aggregate demand. We increased aggregate demand, and as a result, increase in GDP, reduction in unemployment. Next, we are going to start with aggregate supply. So we did aggregate demand. Now we're going to do aggregate supply. And we're going to start off in the short run, which means I get to tell you a very famous quote. Why do we care about the short run? Because in the long run, we are all dead. That's John Maynard Keynes, economist, really fun group. So what's aggregate supply? Aggregate supply is the total real GDP supplied in an economy at various price levels, all else held constant. So just how aggregate demand was very similar to product demand, aggregate supply very similar to product supply. So we're going to take up everything that is every single supply curve in our economy, and you sort of add them up together, and that's going to give you something comparable to aggregate supply. The first thing that I'm going to tell you is that aggregate supply slopes up. So when prices increase, when the price level increases, firms are going to produce more. So our economy will produce more. So aggregate supply will go up. Why? Why does aggregate demand slope up? Well, higher prices result in greater revenue for the firm. So if I sell something for $100 yesterday and $110 today, well, that's obviously better for me. So, but that leads to a question. All right, we have 10% inflation. Stuff that used to cost $100 now costs $110. Well, one of the things we've talked about is that when inflation happens, when stuff gets more expensive, wages increase too. And so, okay, well, the amount I'm selling this stuff for went up to 110, but I'm also paying my employees an extra 10%. So that should be a wash, right? Well, what you want to think about is that in the short run, at least some input costs are fixed. And this brings us how we talk about sticky wages. So what I mean by this is when you take a job and you are paid a salary, your wages are in a sense sticky. They're hard to move around. Because, you're not going to walk into work tomorrow and say, listen, I was just looking, there was inflation of 0.05% last month, and so I need a 0.05% raise. Or you don't walk in, your boss says, oh, prices went down a little, I need you to take a 1.5% pay cut this week, and we'll reevaluate next week. No, a lot of times you'll get your pay reviewed once a year, maybe a little bit more often. So now what we have is that price increases. So for whatever reason, price went up, so I can sell my good for more, right? So if I have a company that sells gum, it's really easy for me to make my gum a little bit more expensive. So my price increases, I'm selling for more money, but my costs stay roughly the same in the short run because a lot of my costs are labor, and the price of labor is fixed in the short run. Well, at the firm level, what does this mean? An increase in price is movement up and to the right on the supply curve, right? So we talked about how if something happens to make the price of the good I'm selling go up, right? So if I have an oil well in my backyard, the price of oil goes up, I'm going to start producing more oil. Maybe I'll buy a better oil derrick, or make the oil pump run more hours. Either way, when the price goes up, I'm going to produce more. So we're going to move it up and to the right on the supply curve. Well, that's what happens for an individual firm. So again, we have price of gasoline quantity that slopes up. When price goes up, I'll produce more. Well, we take all of our firms and everything we're producing. Well, as each firm moves up its supply curve, aggregate supply increases. So now replace the price of gasoline with the price of everything, so our price level. Replace the quantity of gasoline with the quantity of everything, so real GDP. So now we see upward sloping aggregate demand. Now we are going to look at the determinants of aggregate supply. So what I mean by that are, what are some things that can make aggregate supply shift? So we know that movement along the aggregate supply curve comes when price level changes. What makes the price level shift? Or sorry, what makes the aggregate supply curve shift? So it can either decrease or it can increase. It can shift to the left or the right. So what are the things that make it shift? There's a few. First one we'll talk about is productivity. Well, when workers are more productive, the economy can supply more goods and services at the same price level. So this means that if nothing changes about price level or anything else, and it just happens that today, before we go to the factory, all of us drink a bunch of espresso, well, then we're going to be able to produce more, and we're going to see the factory output more. And it didn't happen because prices changed. It happened because all of a sudden, all of our workers are more productive. So this graph here actually shows increases in productivity from, I think it's 1947 to now, and workers are now 5 times as productive. Why? Because we have now gone from using a hand saw to using an electric saw, and having to assemble cars by hand to assembling cars with robots, things like that. All right, I'm going to pause for a moment. Does anyone have any questions? So if anyone was looking for the shifters, we just did productivity. The next one is resource prices. So when resource prices go down, suppliers' costs go down, leading them to supply more goods at the same price level. So we talked about this with individual supply. So we talked about how, I think I had for a steel mill, if the cost of electricity goes down, if you're a country or a firm that imports a lot of oil, when the price of oil goes down, we had the example of how the price of memory has gone down by so much. And so this is leading us to supply more goods, right? So if you're a firm that is supplying computers, this is going to lead you to supply more computers. Next, we have social institutions. So, social institutions, a more general term. Institutions and policies can affect suppliers' willingness to produce goods. And so what we mean by social institutions is really just things like taxes, right? So if you increase taxes enough, firms are not going to want to produce as much. Infrastructure, so you imagine if your company makes washing machines that you have to ship all over the country, and all of a sudden, and the roads are terrible, well, that's going to be a real issue for you in terms of how many washing machines you're going to want to produce. Regulations, maybe if you're a heavily regulated industry, that might affect your supply curve. Property rights, so this is a big deal in developing countries where there's a concern that if you so you'll spend all this money building a factory, and then the government just comes and takes it away from you. Right? So yeah, these are all shifters of aggregate supply. Next, let's think about aggregate supply in the long run. So we talked about the short run. We're going to look at the long run now. Well, after a short-term reduction in GDP due to a lower price level, or maybe accompanied by a lower price level, this is what we called a recessionary gap. So we enter in a recession. Well, what's going to happen then? Well, now all these workers are out there, and a lot of them have lost their jobs. And so we have a surplus of workers. So what happens when we have a surplus? Well, we see that affect the cost. The market has to clear. This is the one where we have lots of Luigis wanting to go to work and not many Marios wanting to hire them. Well, labor costs are going to fall. So I'm going to say, hey, you're paying someone else $100 a day. I'll come in and I'll work for $95 a day because I need a job. Well, that means that labor costs are going to fall. So for a firm, what that means is, oh, my wages have started to adjust. They were sticky and now they sort of come unstuck. So the price I can sell for went from 100 to 90. Well, now I have finally seen my employees' wages go from 100 down to 90. Once that happens, I'm basically back to square one. All the prices are lower, so I'm selling my good for 10% less, but my costs are 10% less, so it's really everything's a wash, and we think that we're probably going to go back to where we started in some sense. On the other side, after a short-run increase in GDP due to or accompanied by a higher price level, that's when we have an inflationary gap. So here's the one where everyone's working a ton of hours. There's very low unemployment. And so we're seeing essentially the economy sort of overheated. GDP is really high, but we're seeing some inflation. Then what happens? Well, firms are going to start competing for workers, right? Now I'm going to go into my boss and say, hey, listen, I need a raise, or else I'll just go find another job. There's not many, it's going to be hard for you to hire. There's not many people available because everyone's working so many hours. Well, then what's going to happen is my wage is going to rise. So again, the wages are starting to come unstuck. They were stuck initially. Now we are at the point in the long run where they're going to be allowed to go up. What happens then? Well, now I'm a firm. For a while, I was selling for 110. It only was costing me 100. So I had this increase in the amount I was supplying. Now what happens is that the wages rise. And so now I get to the point where selling it for 110, but my costs are 110. So the firms are sort of back to where they started. And so they had that time when they were really trying to crank up production because they were able to sell it for a high price. Now what happens is their costs have gone back up. So now the output falls and they're going to be back to square one, back to where they started. So let's take all this information and think about what a long run aggregate supply curve will look like. So first we were here where we had the example where our prices fall. And when prices fell, now all of a sudden I'm still having to pay my workers a lot, but I'm not able to sell my product for very much money, so I'm going to produce less. Then what happens? Well, we said I'm going to cut my workers' pay. That's going to reduce my costs as much as my revenues got reduced. So back to where I started in terms of profits. So I'm going to increase my production back to where I was initially. So I have a new point here. All right, how about the inflationary gap? This is the part where, oh man, I'm making a ton of money, selling my product for a high price, haven't had to give my workers a raise yet. Eventually, I'm going to get to the point where I have to give my workers raises. That's going to reduce the amount I'm willing to pay them. That's going to reduce the amount that I'm willing to provide, shift my aggregate supply to the left, get right back to where we started. We can connect these points to get our long run aggregate supply. So let me go back. I think people are probably writing. So our long run aggregate supply is a vertical line. And hopefully that'll make sense. Let me show you why. Long run aggregate supply is the long run potential of the economy at full employment. So that means we don't have this idea where everyone's working overtime and unemployment is extremely low. We don't have the situation where a bunch of us have lost our jobs and we're competing for a small number of jobs. This is the economy at full employment. All the factories are running. Everyone who wants a job is willing to get one. You can think about it as the labor market is in equilibrium. Well, when that happens, what is determining GDP? Well, the amount of physical and human capital, the number of people in our country, technology, institutions. All of these things are unaffected by the price level, right? So if the price level goes from 100 to 110, we still have all the same factories. Our people still have the same amount of skills. So those are all unaffected by the price level. So what that means is whether the price level is 80 or 90 or 110, the amount that our economy is able to produce in the long run is going to be the same. So our long run aggregate supply is a vertical line. So now let's think about what long run equilibrium looks like. So long run equilibrium means that we're in a aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Notice this is short run aggregate supply. So everything is in equilibrium in the short run. So notice this means that we don't have a bunch of products that are unsold. We don't have a bunch of people wanting to buy stuff that isn't available. That's what we mean by equilibrium. And we should also be in a long run equilibrium. So that means long run aggregate supply is here. So this is what long run equilibrium looks like. Aggregate demand equals aggregate supply equals long run aggregate supply. Next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to relate these ideas of equilibrium to the business cycle. So this next one I won't actually put up on top hat. What do we expect to happen during a recession? So during a recession, what happens is unemployment increases, GDP decreases, right? So recession means we're not producing as much stuff, which means we don't need as many people in our factories, so we see more unemployment. Get a recession. At this point, expansion looks like this, right? GDP going down here, GDP going up here. So let's take a look at some recent recessions. So what we saw is that this is the dot-com bust around 2000. This is the Great Recession. What happened? Well, the blue line is unemployment. Notice how much it went up. The red line is GDP growth, and so GDP growth was very low. At this point, it was actually negative, so we see a fall in GDP. That's a blank there. Unemployment increases and GDP falls. What does that look like in terms of what we've learned about today? Well, that we could think about as a demand decrease. So people got scared during the Great Recession. Your house isn't worth as much. You're not going to go out and make a big purchase. So we have a decrease in aggregate demand. What does that mean? Well, aggregate demand decreases. We went from here down to here. So we would see prices fall, or at least have lower inflation, and GDP fall. So this is our recession. GDP fell because of aggregate demand. GDP fell, so that's how we got a recession. Now let's think about an expansion. Oh, and this slide up here should say demand increase. With an expansion, what we get is aggregate demand shifts to the right. So all of a sudden, we've come out of a recession. We're feeling good. All of a sudden, I feel like I have plenty of money. I'm going to go out and spend it. Aggregate demand goes from here up to here. Notice that we're getting an increase in price, so we'll see some inflation, and we see an increase in GDP. So expansion means unemployment decreases, GDP increases. So here, this is coming out of the Great Recession up until right before COVID hit. We were seeing consistent GDP growth of around 5%. So again, expansion, the blank should say unemployment decreases and GDP increases. And we saw the examples I was using, it was happening because of a demand shift.